So I wanted to read to you a small story today from a book called Haunted Connecticut, put out by Cheri Farnsworth as we watch some beautiful snow falling from my backyard. The Hartford Witch Hangings. Here is a little tidbit you may not have known, at least if you're not from Connecticut. 3 decades before the Salem Witch Trials began in the province of Massachusetts Bay, the colony of Connecticut had already been there and done that, and had closed a shameful chapter in the annals of its early history. Many speculate that Connecticut judges and officials had came to their senses in 1660s and realized it was unfair and not very becoming of the righteous to accuse their neighbors of witchcraft or sorcery, simply because the complainants had an unpleasant experience in their life. It was not necessary at first for the accused to be supported by valid evidence in the court. All that was necessary was the opinion of the accuser and little else. So basically, anyone with any kind of a gripe could accuse their neighbor of witchcraft. By 1670, judges finally acquitted the last accused witch in the colony, and the entire Hartford witch panic had finally come to rest in 1670. Even with the discouraging lack of documentation regarding the Connecticut witch trials, also known as Hartford Witch Trials, the records have survived the test of time and have been discovered in centuries-old trunks, has given determined historians enough information to piece together the grit of what actually happened. The witch trials of Connecticut lasted from 1647 to 1663, when the last witch was tried, incarcerated, and ultimately acquitted and released from jail in 1670. The very first execution of an individual accused of witchcraft in all colonial America took place in a meeting house square in Hartford, Connecticut. Today, the old State House stands in its place. Considering what we know now about the location of the witch hangings, perhaps Joseph Stewart, who some believe still wander to and from the Museum of the Curiosities into the 3rd floor of the old State House, has not been the only spirit with a reason to be there. More than 100 years before Stewart was even born, there were others whose lives were cut brutally short in the gallows. Elise Young, aka Alice, of Windsor, was the first person in the 13 colonies to be hung specifically for witchcraft. The governor of Massachusetts scribbled in his journal, "One of Windsor, arraigned and executed at Hartford for a witch." A notation was also discovered in the diary of Windsor's second town clerk, which said, "May 26, 47, Elise Youngs was hanged." Nothing else regarding her life and the specific accusations against her have been found. However, genealogy researchers suggest that she was likely 47 years old, the wife of John Young, a town of Windsor property owner who lived there from 1641 to 1649, and he had left 2 years before his wife's troubled demise. It is believed that the couple had a daughter, Alice Young Bingham, who tragically met the same fate as her mother 30 years later in Springfield, Massachusetts. In the New World, fear was around every corner. Fear of God's wrath, fear of Satan, fear of strange weather, fear of witches and goblins, fear of the unknown. We will probably never know why someone was fearful of Elise and believe her to be a witch. Was her accuser ill or having nightmares? Suffering from loss of a crop or livestock? Was it bad weather? Poverty? An ingrown toenail, perhaps? Or an epileptic seizure? The reason to believe someone was a witch in the colonial times was as numerous as the collective imaginations of the paranoid settlers. No excuse was too big or too small to blame on a witch. However, records indicate that a more likely scenario is in the case of Elise Young, that is, maybe she was blamed for the death of someone in the community during the fearful influenza epidemic. The settlers across the region in 1647, the same year Elise was condemned and executed for witchcraft. So many children and adults fell victim to the epidemic, and a number of deaths rose dramatically that year. Since science was, for the most part, not well understood by the commoners in those times, blame had to go on to the devil, the source of all misfortune, according to their belief. And that meant finding a hapless individual among them who they believed was involved in doing the devil's work. Maybe Elise casually greeted a neighbor on the street with a harmless, "How do you fare, good wife?" and the neighbor soon fell ill. Surely Elise must have caused it with witchcraft, her accuser believed, for she was the last person with that neighbor. Maybe she simply looked at somebody wrong, or maybe she tended to a sick neighbor who suddenly died. Well, there you go. Believe the accuser. Elise is at it again, which meant the devil made her do it. This is how skewed the Puritan mind was regarding misfortune in their lives. That is how easily blame could be cast upon others, based on nothing more than suspicion, superstition, and genuine fear. There is no science in their reasoning, at least not in those early days in the colonies. There is only God to thank for, and Satan to blame for misfortune. Period. Case closed. In Elise Young's case, we can only speculate on what went terribly wrong. All we know for certain is that she was tried, convicted, and executed for the crime of witchcraft. Unfortunately for her, just 5 years earlier, in 1642, witchcraft had been decreed a capital offense by the Connecticut colonial government, remaining such from 1642 until 1715, when it was finally removed from the list of 12 capital crimes. So Elise held the dishonor of being the first person to put the decree to the test. Her execution probably went like this, assuming it was handled similar to other executions for witchcraft that followed, and were more thoroughly documented. Hands bound tightly behind her back, she was led through the growing crowd to the gallows, where a stern sermon about sin and piety was read to the audience as a reminder of what could happen to any of them if convicted of a capital offense. She climbed unsteadily onto the scaffold, or stepped halfway up to a ladder leaning against a hanging tree. Her petticoat was tied securely around her legs with rope or ribbon, and a noose was slipped over her head and adjusted just to the right tension. Then either the trapdoor opened or the ladder was pulled out from under her, depending on which manner of hanging was used, and she was left dangling with her feet swaying just inches from the ground. Once she was clearly dead, her body would be cut down and burned. The last thing she heard at the moment of the drop were gasps of onlookers, and the last thing she saw with her earthly vision, before it went black, was a mob of misguided, mistaken townsfolk, gawking, groaning, and pointing up accusingly at her, fist raised angrily towards the poor woman in self-righteous indignation. When an execution was ordered in colonial New England, it was normally for family members, neighbors, and strangers to gather around the gallows with a mixture of sadness, an attention of good riddance, or a bit of morbid curiosity. Hundreds of these God-fearing colonists brought their children along to witness the hangings and hear the sermons that accompanied such events. Indeed, these early settlers believed executions were necessary and provided opportunity of lessons on godliness and the heavy price one could expect to pay for consorting with the devil, be it imaginary or not. How sad and hypocritical that anyone would find satisfaction in watching their own people suffer and die. And a teaching moment for the young'uns, no less. Tell me now, who is more dangerous and ungodly? The complicated, cold-hearted speculator and petty accuser standing sure-footed on the ground beneath the gallows? Or the falsely accused who were left dead and dangling from a noose above them, because the judges and the accusers got it so wrong? There were more than 36 people tried for witchcraft in Connecticut between 1647 and 1662. 2/3 were acquitted or banished from the colony, but the unlucky 11 listed here were given the shame and blame treatment in a staggering miscarriage of justice. Fare thee well, all. Elise Young, 1647. Mary Johnson, 1648. Joan and John Carrington, 1651. Goodwife Bassett, 1651. Goodwife Knapp, 1653. Lydia Gilbert, 1654. Rebecca and Nathaniel Greensmith, 1662. Mary Sanford, 1662. And Mary Barnes, also in 1662. I read that this morning as I was watching the snow just fall gently, and I thought, may the snow heal those who are wrongly accused of the past, and even those who were witches, may they be at rest.